Hey everybody, it's Dr. J, and today, we're talking about enthalpy. Let's talk chemistry. Alright, so before we talk about enthalpy, there's a couple of different things I just want to remind everybody, right? Because this is going to be in the Chem 2 playlist. But if you want just a basic introduction to enthalpy, I highly recommend just going back to the General Chemistry 1 playlist. Alright, so enthalpy. Well, that's in what we call thermodynamics. So exactly, thermo is once again heat, in this case energy, and then dynamics, of course, is the movement. So when we're talking about thermodynamics, we're talking about the movement of heat or the movement of energy. Okay, that's all what thermodynamics is about. And then here are some previous terms that you probably heard about before, but I just want to remind you before we get into enthalpy. So if I'm talking about the system, right, we're talking about the portion of the universe that we're considering. All right, so we're talking about the thing that is doing it. All right, so you got an open system. That's where our energy and matter are being transferred. Closed system, energy is only being transferred in an isolated system. There's no transfer of nothing. All right. So we got our system, and then we got the surroundings. All right. So our system is what's doing everything, the system, and then the surroundings is everything else. All right. Isolated system is basically no transfer of heat. Kind of mentioned that before. Isothermal is basically the system that will have a constant temperature. All right. Depending on if you're adding or subtracting your heat from the surrounding. And then lastly, heat capacity. So this is the amount of heat energy required to raise the temperature of a certain amount of material by 1 degree. In this case, 1 degree Celsius, or it could be 1 Kelvin. All right, and then we have specific heat capacity and molar heat capacity. The main difference between the two, one of them is gram, specific heat, one of them is moles, molar heat capacity. Once again, I highly recommend going to General Chemistry 1 if none of these terms sound familiar. And before we get into enthalpy, just one more thing, right? We had to talk about state functions. State functions are basically system properties, right? Just as, once again, this is a review before we get there, such as pressure, volume, temperature. These things are state functions, okay? So essentially, a state function depends only on the state of the system in this case, and not on the way in which the system came to be in that state. Okay, a change in the state function describes a difference between the two states and is independent of the process or pathway by which the change occurs. So, right, essentially, everybody, sum this all up, state functions, we don't care about the process, we only care about the final and initial values. That's it, okay? Once again, if this does not sound familiar, please check the General Chemistry 1 playlist. But essentially, right, if we think about an example, say we're heating up a block of iron from room temperature, right, to 100 degrees Celsius. And in this case, we don't really care how we do it, right? I don't care if, I threw that iron out in some lava and that's how it got heated up. Or, I put it in a microwave, or if I put it outside in the hot sun and then it gradually heats it up, right? State functions do not care about the process, right, of how we get there. We're only focused on the initial state and the final state conditions. So essentially, right, we're going to focus on what it started with and what it ends. That's it. Okay. So certain things aren't state functions, right? Like for miles per gallon, right? We cannot consider this a state function because it's very, very dependent on the path that is taken, right? If you're speeding up the car, or if there's wind, right, or if your tire has a certain amount of pressure, or if you got going up hills, right? Too many factors, so it's not going to be a state function. Now, what we're about to talk about, enthalpy is a state function. So we only care about initial and final values, right? So these are the terms. Let's get to enthalpy. Enthalpy, delta H, right? This is enthalpy, delta H, or enthalpy of reactions. All right, so depending on your chemical reaction, you're either going to absorb heat or you're going to release it. Okay, and in this case, key thing, everybody, please remember, when I'm talking about heat, I'm talking about energy, right? So either you're absorbing energy or you're releasing energy, okay? And a couple of different things as well. Enthalpy, key component of this is that enthalpy is always going to be at a constant pressure. right? If you're not at a constant pressure, then this isn't going to work. Okay, so once again, enthalpy is at a constant pressure. Okay, so enthalpy or heat of reaction, and then we're going to be using H, right? Delta H. And if this delta sign, you forgot about it, delta sign means, right, the change, right? So we're talking about the change in enthalpy. Okay, so a couple different things, right? If you got a positive delta H, that means, right, that you got an endothermic reaction. So essentially an endothermic reaction is when our heat, right, that energy is being absorbed in a reaction. So usually we see this with cold reactions, right? All cold reactions probably going to be endothermic. Next, if you got a negative value for your enthalpy, then that's going to let me know, right, that heat is being given off, right? We're releasing that energy. So if you're releasing energy, you probably got an exothermic reaction. Therefore, you have a hot reaction, okay? So these are the two different types of reactions, endothermic and exothermic, right? So couple of little tidbits just so you know, some little gems out there to throw. If you ever see like delta H, but with this knot, right? So they call this a knot. Basically, this little circle is letting you know that this is standard enthalpy. Now, standard enthalpy means that you're under standard conditions. In this case, your pressure is going to be constant, right? Because we're talking about enthalpy, but your pressure is 1 atmosphere. Your concentration, you're dealing with concentration, is going to be 1 molar. Okay, so these are the standard conditions. So you got this little knot sign over here, right? And then one other thing, temperature is not defined or part of the standard conditions, but we usually consider room temp to be, the normal, 25 degrees Celsius or 298 Kelvin. We also have standard enthalpy of formation, right? So once again, what is standard enthalpy of formation? Well, this is the amount of heat absorbed or released in a reaction in which 1 mole of the substance is formed from its elements and their standard states. Okay, in this case, like I mentioned before, the temperature is usually going to be around 25 degrees Celsius. All right, or this all summed up is basically the heat of formation. Heat of formation. So a couple different things, right? And then, like I said, this is in the Chem 2 playlist. I went over this in the Chem 1 playlist, but we're just, once again, we're going to dive deeper into thermodynamics this go around. All right, but with this enthalpy one, right? Let's look at this one right here. Delta H of formation, basically 0 will be for any element in the standard state. Okay, and then this is under the standard conditions, of course. So we look at examples. Say we got graphite reacting with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, right? Because this carbon and oxygen are in their element in a standard state, the enthalpy for the reaction will be 0 and 0. Okay, and in this case, our enthalpy for this carbon dioxide is already defined, right? Because we understand that this is enthalpy of formation. So all these values we already know, right? Shout out to all the old chemists that did it for us. Right, but we know these values. In this case, carbon dioxide is going to be a negative 393.5 kilojoules per mole. So once again, this means that every 1 mole, there's this amount of joules, right, energy being given off. Now, when we go to do our enthalpy of formation, remember, enthalpy of formation is just products minus reactants. In this case, that's going to be negative 393.5 minus 0, right? Because our reactants are just 0. So our enthalpy of formation for carbon dioxide is negative 393.5 kilojoules per mole. Now, because this is a negative sign, this is letting me know that this reaction, right? This reaction is going to be releasing energy. And if you're releasing energy, you got an exothermic reaction. So like I mentioned, right, we already know these values. We know the values for enthalpy of formation right here. Bam, we see carbon dioxide, negative 393.5. Thank you very much. And we got a lot of them, right? There's a lot of different stuff, right? That's the reason why we like enthalpy of formation. It's very simple. And then on this chart, we got entropy and Gibbs. Pay attention, right? Go look at the other videos that's talking about entropy and Gibbs.